Hello, hello, if you can hear me. Welcome back this afternoon. Hopefully you all enjoyed our morning program. It seemed really well attended, and the speakers were just awesome. So we're going to get started now. If I can have you all sort of come in and find your seats and finish up the conversations, that would be great. As you know, this format is a little different this year. This particular session is a little study on the office and industrial markets, and then Charles is going to talk a little bit about those markets up in the Bangor area. These folks are well-versed in being here. Nate's been here, and Justin's been here, I don't know, 10 times? 10 years? How long? 13. So we all had hair back then. But anyway, Charles is new to the panel, but I'm sure he'll do awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Nate, who's going to get things started. Oh, Justin's going to get things started. So Justin Lamontagne from NAI, the Dunham Group. Here you go.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Craig. This is a little different for us, but I have my podium, so I'm happy. Thank you, first of all, to MEREDA, as always, for the opportunity to do this. I'd also like to thank our marketing team, Marina Termel and Melissa Neptune. These guys help us put together these slides, as well as the industrial market survey. Hard copies are available downstairs and online, of course. Let's get my clicker. Here's a brief outline as to what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to start by taking a look back at 2023. That data really explains everything that we saw in 2023. And then I'll also talk a little bit about, there we go. Then, of course, we'll get into the forecast, and we'll take a look ahead to 2024. But like I said, I do want to start with the current conditions, and I'm happy to report that we were able to expand our survey this year. And I want to thank Sam Leggett. I'm not sure if he's in here. My new partner at the Dunham Group. He and I spent a lot of man hours, along with one of our summer interns, Jake Dubé, adding over 300 new buildings to our inventory. So we added over 9 million square feet. So we're now studying a total of 30 million square feet of industrial real estate in southern Maine. And I really appreciate his efforts in getting that done. So you can see here, I got to juggle. You can see here, this expanded look does allow us to dive a little deeper into the sub-regions, is what we're calling it, and perhaps identify some opportunities. Lewiston, Auburn, for example, you can see vacancy rate is seemingly a healthy 5.8%. However, if you really dig in on that number, it's a bit deceiving in that virtually all of Lewiston's vacancy is in a small handful of very large buildings. So if you're a small business looking for 2,000 to 10,000 square feet of industrial space in Lewiston, Auburn, you have virtually no options. Saco and Biddeford, Northern York County, there's a few opportunities and spaces, but what really struck me on this data is that greater Portland vacancy rate of 0.66%. That's a subregion of 20 million square feet. It's the area that I've really been studying since 2011, and even if we factor in the sublet space that's available, we're barely over 1%. And this chart shows the numbers since I've started studying, and this is in fact the lowest supply has ever been since 2011. It's not great. The blue line is the vacancy rate. The red line is is cap rates. Overall, we did see some level of plateauing, a little bit of tick up. I'm certain that has to do with interest rate pressure, but a lot of 1031 money still in the market, a lot of cash still in the market that are less impacted by interest rates. Average lease rates increased again, but interestingly, you'll note it continued to sort of just tick up, not nearly as drastically as the vacancy rate. I have to think this has to do with tenant pushback. I'm going to get into a little bit more on that later. Unfortunately, ultimately, I think the tenants will lose this fight, and going into 24 and 25, I've already seen some new listings come out. The asking prices are almost all over $10 a foot, so I do think we'll see a jump, but this past year it was relatively steady. Average sales prices per year. Look, with any new sale listing, the accepted strategy is you don't get what you don't ask for. We're still basing things on comparables and data as much as we possibly can, but we have to project as brokers when we're setting these prices this continued appreciation. So the truth is all it takes is one buyer, all it takes is one, maybe it's a 1031 exchange. So really, why not push the value? And frankly, that strategy has been working. You can see we've got an increase of another 10% since last year in average sales, and this is based on 40 sales that I could find, so it's good data. There's a lot going on in this chart. This is nationally. I don't want you to look at it all. What I really wanted to highlight is what they did right. The blue lines, the blue bars, are net completions. That's added inventory. The red line is vacancy rate. Vacancy rate goes down, completed projects go up, the vacancy rate goes up. That's a healthy market. Unfortunately, in southern Maine, in spite of the warning signs that we've had for a decade or so, and despite some of the efforts of the folks in this room, we really just didn't add enough inventory. I think the numbers speak for themselves. So those are the facts. What did it mean to the market in 2023? Clearly, 6 straight years of a sub 3% vacancy rate, multiple offers on anything for sale. Yeah, clearly a very, very competitive market. That said, I will point out that in the third and fourth quarters of the year, things slowed down a little bit. And it wasn't that deals were cratering or there was any panic. It just felt a little slower. Less inquiries, less activity. And, it could be an anomaly, but I'd also say January and this month so far, it's still a little bit quieter than I would have expected. We'll see what that all means. And that actually did translate into some of our transactional activity, at least for my firm. I looked at our numbers, and for the first time in over a decade, our number of transactions, the volume, decreased. And it actually decreased significantly. We just didn't have enough inventory to move. Pretty simple. As such, the monetary value plateaued, but the average per deal increased quite a bit, as you'd imagine. So put a different way, we didn't have a lot to sell, but when we did have something to sell or lease, we sold it for a premium. So I expect that trend to continue in 2024. I can't ignore what's happening in the leasing market. We saw some signs of real increased tensions, and I guess this is expected or should be expected. Our jobs as brokers right now is really to kind of navigate those waters as best as possible. As I mentioned, tenants are doing their best to push back. Landlords have the upper hand in terms of supply and demand, but tenants do have some cards to play. We tried to play every card we could, mostly macroeconomic. The economist this morning mentioned some of them. Inflation, the rising cost of goods across the board, of the uncertain economy, scary world wars, the climate, you name it. A client of mine actually summed it up pretty well. He said, look, you could tell me what you think the building is worth. The landlord could tell me what he thinks it's worth. We can only afford so much rent. And I thought that was a pretty powerful statement, and I used it as part of the negotiation, and it helped get us the deal done. Renewal options are really tricky. If you signed a deal 5 or 10 years ago and your space today is worth significantly more than what it was, those numbers are going to be quite disparate. So that's where these kind of more tenuous negotiations can begin. And from a landlord's perspective, I think it's really important to remember, sure, you have an opportunity to get more rent, but it could come at the cost of losing a tenant, and of course we know losing tenants can be costly in terms of replacing a tenant. TI, commissions, legal fees, could be some vacancy carrying costs. So I tend to try to coach my landlords. The whole bird in hand theory still holds true, but it doesn't always work. Of course, a very common question I get in this room, why not more industrial development? And there's certainly been some examples, but not nearly enough. And why haven't we kept up with demand, I guess, is the question, and it's still just an intimidating prospect. It takes time. Even at replacement costs, where I just showed you those average sales prices, we're getting close to replacement costs. There's still some hesitancy to build new. There's pressure on pricing. There is, we think construction costs have maybe plateaued, but I tend to think that they're still going up. Interest rates are certainly causing some uncertainty, at least for the second half of the year. And there seems to be that sort of general lack of consumer confidence. Again, I think the economist this morning kind of touched upon that, thanks to all these sort of worldly concerns that we're looking at, and that probably accounted for the slowdown that I talked about. And then land. Land continues to be difficult to find, at least developable land, and certainly in Greater Portland. I'm excited to see Gorham's Industrial Park expand. However, I don't think there's any actual shovels in the ground, and that's not anything against anybody involved in those projects. Raw land just takes a long time. And of course, I do continue to strongly lobby for expansion of industrial zones and loosening up of non-industrial zones. Here are some, let's take a look into 2024. Here's some significant vacancies. I won't spend a lot of time here, but generally there are a few larger spaces available, but not a lot. Here's some predictions. I do think we will see some new construction, however, not enough. Clearly, what speculative development that we did see in the last few years has been successful. I hope there's more of it. I'm not counting on it. And when I talk about land that gets built, and actually sold, and then actually developed, it's becoming more and more clear that that land needs to be kind of shovel ready. Permits in hand, surveyed, cleared. the more work that can get done prior to putting it on the market, the more likely it is to be sold and actually built upon. Repurposing office and retail, I'm excited to hear what Nate has to think about this, but we've talked about it in the past. Short of new construction, this is an opportunity to add some inventory. It actually has happened in a few cases. I've done a few deals where we've repurposed office buildings into industrial spaces. I expect that to continue. It does require stakeholder buy-in, of course. It's probably easier said than done, but it is something. There's no bad ideas in a market that's this competitive. Another trend that I've talked about in the past is this idea of storing things just in case versus just in time, and it continues. Basically, businesses are taking and hoarding these supplies that they may need for themselves, which not only takes up valuable real estate, but it hurts other businesses that could put those parts and products to good work. The capital market, it's clearly a very popular asset. I don't expect that to change, even with rising interest rates. And we're also pushing this concept of sale-leasebacks as a good investment opportunity, not only for buyers, but for sellers that may not have a great transition plan. It's a good strategic exit for a lot of real estate property owners. The cannabis market continues to slow down. We've talked about this in the last couple of years, and we're continuing to see signs of particularly medicinal cultivation. It was simply oversaturated, no surprise. And the challenge remains, what do we do with these spaces, the very expensive and specific infrastructure for cannabis? How does it translate to other uses? Can we do it, for example, for food processing? They need drains, they need FRP walls, they need power. But, again, easier said than done. The spaces have got to be cleaned, you got to get rid of the smells, et cetera. But we've got to get creative. It's hard to believe, but 4 years next month was COVID. And the pandemic, as you recalled, spurred a lot of transactional activity specific to pandemic-related needs, essential businesses and PPE and vaccine research and testing. Those leases are going to turn over in the next 12 to 24 months. So that could and should loosen some inventory, whether it's sublet or otherwise. And I also wonder, some of these suburban office spaces that are sitting vacant, again, back to can they be repurposed? Are there some sublet opportunities for industrial businesses? Again, just trying to stay as creative as possible. Geographically, I'm going to let Charles touch upon this, but clearly Greater Portland is sold out. We have no room to go except north. Or, unfortunately, my last bullet is a bit somber, they're going to go south. Did I say north? We're going to go south. And so businesses are possibly going to leave Maine, and we may lose jobs because of this extremely tight inventory, and it's a bummer. But not to end on too somber of a note, I do think the Patriots are picking up a receiver, and I think the Celtics are going to take home a championship. So I think we're going to turn it over to Nate now, and he will talk about the office market.
Thank you. What's going on?
One more.
There we go. All right. Thank you, Nate Stevens with the Boulos Company, designated broker partner there, focusing on the office market, at least in this presentation, the last 10 years or so, I think. Thank you to MEREDA for inviting me back again. A lot of kudos to MEREDA, too, for switching up this format. I think it's really fresh. It's great. It's not easy to do. So thanks to Craig and Josh Soley and Shelley for really taking the effort. I like this. Though I am taking a 25-minute presentation, and I'm shrinking it to 10 minutes. So less on the data points, more on the major trends that I see moving into next year, the year after that, maybe in the year after that. A lot of what I'm going to say is pretty much the opposite of what you heard from James Marple like an hour ago. So I thought that was funny. I think he's taking a macro look. I'm looking at just really the greater Portland office market. So it's a forecast conference, but in order for me to tell you where we're going, I got to tell you where we've been and where we are. This is a graph that just shows our direct vacancy rates and the green bars over the last 16 years. Sublease rate is the blue line at the bottom. And we are the blue graph. We just finished our office survey as part of our market outlook at Boulos, where we survey 300 plus buildings in Greater Portland. So pick that up on your way out. It's down at our booth. But we are sitting right at about a 7% vacancy rate this year. As you can see, still a very healthy rate, though it is the highest vacancy rate that we've recorded since the pandemic started. Though really, if you look at the grand scheme of things, we're really just hovering in that 6.5% to 7% range. Really nothing too alarming, especially when compared to 2010, 2012, where it was over 10%. And definitely when you look nationally, and I think that's probably what James was looking at, where you see these larger cities pushing 20 or 30% vacancy, we're obviously nowhere near that. I think where things get a little interesting, and what I've talked about the last couple of years and is still a story to talk about, is the sublease rate. Which is pushing about 3.5%. It's the highest sublease rate we've ever recorded. It even ticked up again last year. Wasn't quite sure that was going to happen. So you take those two combined rates, you're at 10.4%. Still not as high as what we saw in 2010, 2011. And it's a little bit different of a market that we're experiencing than there, where we saw a huge spike, couple of years of plateau, and then dropping. We seem to be hovering in this 6.5%, 7% range, which I think is expected, as we're kind of waiting for the market to catch up to the pandemic with these leases expiring. And when leases don't expire, you have tenants that sublease, which is why we have the higher sublease rate. But I'm not really panicking. I think we're in a good place here in Greater Portland, just such a small market compared to some of the larger areas of the country. We seem to be in a pretty good place, and I'll get into some of that reasoning later, but since this is a forecast conference, I put in a couple years of forecasting here in the yellow. So I do think, we are going to continue to plateau here, probably right around where we are, but then we should start to see things coming down in the next 12 to 24 months. It might even happen next year too, but I didn't want to be too bullish. And I may regret saying this, but I do think the worst of the pandemic with regards to the office market is behind us. Definitely different than what James said this morning. But here in Portland, I have a couple reasons I'll share later. I feel like we're just set up for some improving market conditions moving forward. And even the sublease rate, I think, will start to come down. That will lag the direct rate a little bit, as we'll start to see more subleases come online, but I do think that will start to drop. So really, to kind of give you an idea of this, I usually jump into all 7 submarkets that we cover in the Greater Portland area. I'm just going to touch on the two largest submarkets where there was the most activity, which is downtown Portland and the main mall area of office space. So you have downtown Portland on the left-hand side. Class A is the dark blue, and Class B is the light blue. So starting in Class A, that did bump up last year from about 4% to 6.5%. We did see this coming. The beginning, when I was giving this presentation last year, I talked about gray space, or space that we know is an impending vacancy. Maybe it's vacant, but they're still paying on it. They're not marketing it for sublease because their lease expires in a few months, but we know that it'll be coming online. And at the end of 22, 23, there really wasn't the demand there to offset what we saw coming on supply for 2023. So, it was about 150,000 square feet that hit the market downtown Class A last year. Some of that was sublease, getting turned into direct lease. So we did anticipate that happening. I think moving into next year, we're going to see that plateau, if not come down a little bit. The Class B market improved once again this year. That's 3 straight years of a dropping vacancy rate. It's pretty safe to say that this is entirely due to office conversions. And I'll talk to this a little bit later, but it's safe to say that if it weren't for office conversions in downtown Portland, especially with Class B buildings, this rate would probably still be up in the 13 to 14% range. So it's pretty significant in terms of one trend really shaping the entire market downtown. And then as we move into the main mall area, that's a little bit of a different story. Very volatile market, both A and B, since the pandemic, up, down, up, way up. So last year I was reporting in Class A main mall area that the vacancy rate jumped to 16%. Well, it went up again this year to 19%. That is a high vacancy rate for our market, probably the highest that we've recorded in 25 years at Boulos. When you combine that with the sublease rate, in the previous slide I said the sublease rate was just about 3.5%. Well, in the main mall area it's close to 10%. So you are combining a direct rate of 19 and a sublease rate of 10. That is probably more in line with what we're seeing nationally. And the reason why is that a lot of those vacancies and sublease opportunities in the main mall area are larger national controlled companies that are vacating. They pulled out of the market during COVID, they put their space up for sublease, or they vacated entirely. The majority of the vacancy in the main mall area is made up of larger spaces. And this is a statistic I shared last year, and similar this year, is that over 80% of the suburban vacancy is in the main mall area Class A. It's all concentrated in a 2-mile radius. Of course, that's where the opportunities lie. I mean, if you're a tenant looking, You got every shape and color of space that you could possibly want to look for. I don't think landlords are getting super hungry. That's going to depend on the building. That's going to depend on their position and their debt and so forth. Some are hungrier than others, but that's certainly where the opportunities are in the greater Portland market. And Class B, ticked up a little bit. I'm not worried about it. That was a pretty steady market last year, and for all of the other submarkets, really Westbrook, Falmouth, Yarmouth, pretty medical office space. Not a lot happened last year, was pretty steady. So, where I think things are going, I'm fairly confident that, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a little bit stability moving forward. I haven't really been able to say that the last few years because we weren't sure when some of these lease expirations as they were popping up, whether that was going to have an impact on the vacancy rate or not. So I've been kind of holding those predictions in check the last couple of years. This year, I'm a little more steadfast on, an improving vacancy rate. And some of the reasons why I've kind of laid out here really starts with demand. Demand, as I mentioned, the beginning of 2023 wasn't quite there, but that certainly changed throughout the year. It's safe to say that it's the strongest office demand that I've seen since probably 2018, both on a leasing and owner-occupier purchasing standpoint. It is the first year that we've had leasing volume, just number of leases increase since 2018, which is a little different than industrial. See, we're back now. But just more activity, more tenants on the street, just more things happening. And so, a couple anecdotes with that. I had one tenant, Justin actually helped out with this lease. They just signed a lease. They've been doing one-year leases over the last couple of years. And this year they finally felt confident in the market that they went from 8,000 square feet to 23,000 square feet and signed a 12-year lease. So what that's talking about is confidence in the market. I think that's where that demand is coming from. Tenants the last 4 years they didn't know how they worked. They didn't know how they were going to utilize their offices. They didn't know what their hybrid plan looked like. Well, that's changed. I think tenants have a lot more confidence with how they work. They know their hybrid work plan. They know who's going to be there, who's not going to be there, and that gives them the ability to make these strategic decisions they weren't able to do. Another one of my clients is planning on building a 40,000 square foot office building on their campus. Really haven't heard of anything of that size the last 4 years being planned at this point. That just shows their confidence that they know how they work. They're comfortable in building a 40,000 square foot office building. Opportunities. Another trend moving into the year, certainly submarkets more than others. Class A downtown, Class A suburban markets, especially main mall area. That is where we can meet this demand that's increasing. Whether that demand means positive net absorption, as a tenant moving from 10,000 square feet here to 10,000 square feet there, that's not going to do much for the market, but we still have those opportunities to meet that demand. Gray space, I talked about this a little bit. Part of the reason why, actually the majority of the reason why I'm so rosy on the upcoming years is that we are just not seeing as much gray space at this point in the year. The last 3 years that I've stood up here, I'm seeing 300,000 square feet, 150,000 square feet coming on the marketplace, and I just don't see that right now. Sure, there are going to be surprises. There are going to be big vacancies that pop up. There are already a couple that I know about, but nowhere in the scale, near the scale that I've seen the last couple of years. And then you add that with the increased demand last year, I personally think that that's a recipe for dropping vacancy rates. When you combine lack of gray space, increased demand, we've got space out there that we need to fill, especially in some of those submarkets. So, I think it's important that we keep an eye on that gray space moving into next year. And then conversions. Touched on this a little bit earlier. This is probably what I get asked about the most, which is understandable. It's, pretty interesting, exciting trend. Now, this is something that started prior to COVID, but really took off after COVID with the increase in housing demand downtown. A lot of conversions in downtown. I think over the past 4 years, there have been 15 buildings that have added residential space to changed from office space. And in downtown Portland alone, the Boulos companies removed over 10% of our inventory to residential conversions. And if you shrink that just down to Class B, as I mentioned that dropping vacancy rate the last 3 years, we've removed over 20% of downtown Class B office inventory for residential conversion. Now, these are conversions to residential, hospitality, even some educational conversions, and there are a couple more coming online next year, I think. There is one that was going to go forward that I've heard is not going to. It's not easy doing these conversions. They're expensive. They take a lot of time. Lending climate's a little volatile. So, we'll see a couple. Nowhere at the pace I think we've seen the last couple years, but that's certainly going to keep the Class B market in check. And I think I think all of these 4 items right here really is what's going to keep our vacancy rate possibly going down next year, going down the year after, There isn't going to be some big plummet back to where we were a few years ago, but certainly, I think it's safe at this point that we're not going to have some dramatic spike up to 10% or anything at that moment. Might regret that next year, but anyway, that's kind of my report for this year, quick and easy. If you have any questions, we'd love to take them, but we're going to let Charles come up here, give his talk, and then we'll field all your questions afterward. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to see a full room. I mean, I think our business and our industry is really driven by being in person and meeting, and so much can get to emails, text, stuff like that. So really awesome to see the turnout in the crew here. So kudos to you guys. I'm going to take a little more of a high-level approach on some of the markets outside of Portland. I think Portland, gets the bulk of the attention, whether it's in the media or, it's obviously the biggest market. So I think our goal is to try to capture some of the other areas and give you a sense of what's going on in the state. Let's see if we can get through a couple of these slides here. Green? Top?
First time.
That one. Yeah, I'm the rookie here, so we got to put it. Why isn't that not clicking? Oh, got you. Play. All right, bad for me. Okay, some of the big questions here. I think everyone in this room is thinking, and it's really whether you're a lender, whether you're a lawyer, broker, no matter what it is. Everyone is saying, how is the market? What's going on? What are you seeing out there? I think that's really one of those big drivers that everyone wants to know. And also, are you doing deals? I really am a firm believer in the transactions really tell the story of what's happening in the market, and we're going to do our best to talk about those. And then obviously the biggie is interest rates and where we're headed with those. So without further ado, I'm going to break it down kind of into 4 categories, if you will. We'll go up to Brunswick, Topsom, Bath, talk about some activity there, look at trends and predictions. Augusta, Waterville, I think it's critical to talk about Colby. We could probably do a whole seminar on what's going on there for development. My favorite city, Greater Bangor, we'll talk about some deals up there. The end of some vacancy trauma. They've had some office buildings, for years that have struggled, which have now been converted into residential, which these guys hit on. So, and then Northern Maine, there's a couple big projects up there that we'll talk about. So, Brunswick, Topsom, we'll get into some trends, most importantly, notable deals. We saw BIW lease about 15,000 feet at 329 Bath Road. American Steel, which is a local steel supplier here in South Portland, it had surged up in that market for a while. For a warehouse facility, is really very little supply, as Justin noted. They ended up taking a piece of land and new construction of 52,000 feet. They're a major supplier of BIW. So I think as long as the government keeps ordering those ships, we'll have that big demand up there. Opbox is a startup that takes shipping containers and converts them into usable space. Tim Millett in my office did this deal up in Woolwich. It was a former Carvana dealer that, the building just during COVID didn't work out for them, but this allows them to move into a site and possibly expand. Martins Point, Nate has a building up there. I think it's under contract, so we won't release any data there. But, and then a built-to-suit over in Brunswick Landing. Vivid Cloud did about 22,000 feet. So as far as predictions, Justin talks about the industrial market and how tight that vacancy rate is. I really think it's heading north, and we're going to see users and owners with a willingness to build up there and lease in those markets when, traditionally they just wouldn't go that far. So I think in the next couple of years, you're going to see some either built-to-suits or even some spec development up in those markets. Augusta, Waterville, quickly, Central Maine Commerce Center that sold for $18.5 million. I think Chris sells this every 2 or 3 years. I don't know if he's in the room, but congrats. Avangrid leased 20,000 square feet at 60 Darren Drive. State of Maine IT department leased about 16,000 feet. I know they were in the market for a while. J.S. McCarthy, I think that was just a small expansion in Augusta. And Days Jewelers, who's based in Waterville, I think they had done a pretty global search of space, and they ended up coming back to Waterville and leasing 10,000 feet from Bill Mitchell in a small little redevelopment play, but that was a cool story. As far as inventory up there, there's a group out of Rhode Island with about, they could do 50 to 150,000 of industrial in Sydney, which is between Augusta and Waterville. And then there's obviously land in First Park, which I think would allow for some future development. Colby, as I said, I think if you're a Mainer and you haven't stopped off this exit and looked at what they've done up there, you really should. Paul Urenick and his team have just done an amazing job to transform that community. And, from a hotel to performing arts to restaurants, it's really brought Main Street back to life. And I think it's just amazing what they've done up there. So kudos to the crew up at Colby. As far as predictions, Augusta, Waterville, I think you'll see some continued development at Colby, more investment in and around the capital in Augusta. And I think, demand for industrial is just going to continue, and it's going to just keep going north. Greater Bangor saw quite a bit of real good activity up in this market. JSI Fixtures, they leased 64,000 feet on Outer Hammond Street. Was an older warehouse building that was pretty tired, and the brokers pulled together a buyer, put together a nice TI package, and were able to land that deal. Tyler Technology has broken ground in Orono. You guys might be familiar with the old Orono Inn right there near campus. Max Simpson in my office did this deal, and they bought literally the old hotel on the river, tore it down, and they're going to build a brand new building there. So it's exciting for the university to see, a group like this make the investment to really, prosper employees and talent, which was a really nice trend to see. Sargent Corp bought the old, I call it Microdyne, I think the last tenant was the Next Links. They're going to convert this, I think it has been converted to their corporate headquarters with an additional level of space available. But this was a building that had sat for a little while, and again, a local company showing a major commitment to the market. Bangor Savings Bank is going to do another about 36,000 feet right next to their campus on the waterfront. This is the old Barry Dunn building. This is going to be exciting to see this come together. This is just a photo of downtown Bangor. These are 4 separate office buildings that over the last, call it 5 to 7 years, have all been converted to residential. Some of you guys might know the term vacancy trauma, which has, really hit some of these downtown markets. And these have really all turned out quite nice with brand new residential units. Lastly, we'll just finalize. Northern Maine has some really, I think, tremendous signs of life and some exciting projects in an area that's really been hit, pretty hard over the last, call it 10 or 15 years. One North in Millinocket is a 1,400-acre site in which some local business people have put together, and they've targeted, sustainable forest products, data storage. I know they've got aquaculture up there, but really some alternative, type uses. If you have that land area, you could do that. So I would say keep your eyes on that and see how things go. And then the Green for Maine program, I think they've got a booth downstairs. That's Scott Hinkle and his group. Loring Air Force Base is literally got hundreds of thousands of square feet in space available and ready to go. They already have Kenworth trucks. There's a accounting center, museum, and then an agricultural center. So that is kind of, as we say in Maine, we took the drive up 95. And I'd say let's go, 2024. Thank you, guys.
So we've got, looks like about 15 minutes, and we would love to field any questions. We did come prepared to kind of ask ourselves some softballs, but if there's anybody that would like to step up to a mic or just throw it out, yeah, you don't have to even go to the mic.
Good afternoon. Bill Mann from the city of South Portland. Some of the vacancy, Nate, that you talked about, the office space in the mall area, similar to the downtown space that Charlie talked about in Bangor. I think you're seeing some of those are being converted to non-office uses and also some residential conversion. So I guess my speculation or question is are some of those percentage a little high and lagging some of the conversions that are taking place?
Sure. So I think you're asking about maybe possible conversions of some of the main mall area vacancies. So to convert to residential, you need a couple things going for you, and one of them is a small floor plate. You know, a lot of these Class B buildings in downtown Portland that are being converted are floor plates that are 5 to 10,000 square feet, so you can have a hallway, you can have 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartments, and studios, which are the ones that are the most popular right now. The problem with a lot of the buildings in the main mall is that you have 30 to 40,000 square foot floor plates. So not super easy to go residential on those. I think some of the single story ones we'll see converted to industrial. We saw a couple office buildings on Darling Avenue last year get converted for Food Labs was one of them. And there was another one just down the street. So maybe some of those. There are some buildings that in the main mall area, I think like 175 Running Hill Road has some vacancy where the Hartford used to be. That would be a great residential conversion just because it actually used to be a hospital, so it has really kind of skinny wings on it. Some of these larger buildings, though, I think we'll see in bigger markets like down in New York and even suburban Boston, well, they'll cut a hole in the middle of the building for like a courtyard, and then you'll have residential on the outside. We just are not able to do that here in Portland for a myriad of different reasons, but mostly expense and what you're getting for your return on those residential units just doesn't make that possible. Plus, there's other inventory to do it right now. Maybe if we run out of conversion inventory and the housing demand's still strong, we might start to see that. And I don't know if Justin wants to touch on some of the industrial stuff.
Well, I was actually going to, is this on? Okay, I was actually going to piggyback on the office market. I think some of the large office buildings that you have seen success reletting are those that are willing, with landlords willing to subdivide. And that's what's going to be really critical. It's also a significant expense to do so, to cut a 50,000 square foot footprint down to 10 or 20 or 30. The truth of the matter is, the Unum building is a great example of it. Craig's done the leasing there. Unum has, made the commitment to invest in that building to cut it down to, I don't know, what do you got, 7 or 8 tenants now. 300 Southborough is another example in Scarborough where the landlord was willing to invest in interior walls and in additional restrooms and keep it office space. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all of these large office buildings need to go residential or industrial. They can be office buildings. We're just not going to have a lot of 200,000 square foot tenants coming to Maine. I think those days are over. So most of the office demand, especially in the suburbs, is going to be 5 to 20,000 square feet.
Next.
Bangor area conversions of some of the older buildings. What kind of hurdles can you speak to for building systems, such as air quality, fire code, life safety, handicap accessibility, and does public funding or has public funding played a role in bringing those to completion?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And some of those buildings are extremely old, and logistically, it's a tough setup. I know some of them have some involvement in historic tax credits, which can make the projects, what I would call feasible. In a market like Bangor, the rents are dramatically different than the rents in Portland. So you do need some assistance, whether it's through the historic credits. I know there's some TIFs available. Bangor even had, I think, a facade grant credit, which you could apply with some of those older buildings to basically reskin them, and they had literally, an account set apart for that. So, great question. I think every developer, as they get into those deals, you're until you open the buildings up, you don't know what you're going to find. But I do know from, dealing with Bangor that they've had those things available to make those deals work, which is probably the only way they get done. So, great question.
Yeah, I can jump in on this too from, any conversion, life safety is the #1 challenge. A lot of these older buildings have one stairwell. So then you need to add another one. Okay, that's the money. But what if it's a historic property? Well, then you need to go get approvals for that. One conversion project that I've been working on for 3 years, we had to get an external staircase approved. It took 18 months. We had to get a third party out of state to come in and consult. It's not easy from a municipal level, but historic tax credits in terms of federal funding, that's the big piece. And if we can expand those, as they were talking about earlier in the legislative piece, that's going to make these conversions a lot easier and more feasible. Any more questions?
Yep, go ahead, give it a yell.
Conventionally financed multifamily housing in any of these areas of any scale. Folks all know when you go to Westbrook, it's units 4 over 4. They're in Westbrook, they're in Cumberland, they're in Scarborough, they're in something similar to that in Brunswick. But once you get north of that area, and there is some going in Auburn, so it's kind of like this thing's moving north. But there's almost no conventionally financed projects like that of any size, the result of which is there ain't no comps. I tend to believe that if you put something out there, there'll be some people who will pay up for that kind of quality, the newer quality units. So that's one issue. The other issue is I also don't see that the HUD FHA insuring folks, 221D3, 221D4. I looked at some numbers nationally, compared Maine to other parts of New England, and we're getting the short end of the stick there because they send these appraisers up, and they can't get things to work, so they don't come up with a compensating program. It doesn't happen. So I'm wondering whether you folks have any insights into what we might do to break that barrier, if you will. You look at Augusta, there's plenty of income in Augusta with the government jobs, et cetera. It just seems to me that there's got to be a way to do it, and maybe just take someone to start building a couple of these small 12, 24 unit, 36 unit projects. But I'm wondering, with your expertise, what you folks think about that.
The wrong panel to ask.
Yeah.
Are you talking about there aren't any comps out there to support higher rents for housing, so maybe developers aren't taking the shot at building or conversions? Yeah. Yeah. I think I remember, I'm not a pro on the Lewiston Auburn market, but there was a housing project in Auburn. I believe it was a conversion recently in the last couple of years that, it was a big risk. It was if we build it, they will come. And they didn't know if they could get $2,000 a month for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment in Auburn. And that's why we love the developers, because they take those risks. And they can study the markets, and maybe it's not the same market, but maybe you're looking at Rumford in terms of what things. There have been some great conversion projects down there. And so I don't know if I have a clear answer to your question, but I know that in Auburn, I don't know how they financed it, but that was just a big risk that developer had to take. Is this market ready to support rents that high? And they did that. It filled up in like a month.
Looking into the future, where do you see opportunities for investors, tenants getting into the market, new construction?
Well, I've said it on stage. I really do think that there's a place for speculative development for industrial, although 3 bankers in the last 2 days have told me that they're not interested in it, or it's just challenging to do. I shouldn't say that. So for whatever reason—
Can those lenders stand up, please?
Yeah, raise your hand. You know who you are.
No tickets for you.
You know who you are. But with a vacancy rate of under percent, Nate just said it. If you build it, it works for residential. If you build it, they will come. There's just not enough inventory. But you've got to be willing to make that plunge. So if I were going to park any money, we were actually playing with sort of that concept as a question for the 3 of us. If I were going to put money into something personally right now, it would be on, a speculative industrial development with access anywhere for 15 minutes north or south of Westbrook off 95, and it will be leased. There's no question about it before the project's done. But with industrial,
Who's taking the inventory? Is it cannabis?
No. Traditional users. Yeah, no, cannabis has really slowed down quite a bit. Traditional industrial users. I would say this, though. I would chop, if I were going to build a 16,000 square foot building, I would turn it into 4 units, similar to what I was talking about with the office market. Having a level of diversity, smaller-ish tenants, it just is a much, much safer bet still in Maine.
I'm not going to build an office building on spec with no tenants. Yes, I'm rosy on the outlook of next year, but that wasn't even happening when our vacancy rate was 2%. So in terms of office investment, I love the stories of these smaller secondary, tertiary towns in Maine with some of these older Class B office buildings that can be converted to residential. I still think there's a market for that. I don't think it's going anywhere. Maybe downtown might be getting a little saturated with new apartments. There were a ton in new construction and conversions this year. But that's where I see some fun investments in the next couple of years, are some of these smaller town conversions for office space.
Yeah, I'm really with Justin on the industrial piece. I think that's really, kind of the future of where Maine's going. And you look at some of those charts with the rates, and, I remember 10 years ago when, $5-6 a foot was a big deal, and now you're seeing rents at 10 and 12, and it's really drives a lot of demand. But I think it's just a super safe play. Anytime you see an industrial listing, there's always demand. There seems to always be tenants. So whether it's a piece of land that you can secure and get it permitted, some guys even put up a shell of a building. You leave the floor, without the concrete, and you wait to see who arrives, and you subdivide the building that way. But yeah, I'm a big believer in the industrial market in Maine.
That's a great concept, and that's been a proven winning concept where, Charles just said, you lay the foundation, you put up the walls, and kind of leave it at that, maybe the roof, but then it allows industrial tenants in particular, I don't know if they just lack vision or timing or what, it at least lets them see, okay, this is where we're going to be, and a clear path to tenancy. It's very difficult to sell. These guys will tell you a build-to-suit package for an industrial user. I don't totally know why, but it's a difficult pitch. So in Scarborough, for example, off the Haggis Parkway, we just completed a project where Carrie Anderson built a 10,000 square foot shell of a building, and that's what they marketed. But they started it when he had that shell up, and we were able to get a tenant within 3 months. So it really worked well.
Did they have to have a crane system up top, or
How do you mean?
for moving in the industrial products around? A lot of people want cranes up top. And
No, and that's not the kind of thing that we would necessarily design for. If a tenant required that or asked for it, we certainly could provide that. But typically, no, just overhead doors and a loading dock. We got 1 more minute. Any other questions? Paula, you got a question? No.
Hi, coming from a coastal community, given the flooding that took place in December and January, are you seeing more of your clients asking about environmental vulnerabilities of different properties? Is that of concern to people?
Yes. Yeah, it's clearly on everyone's mind, and it's just another part of, I think, due diligence. Appropriate due diligence is understanding where water is coming from, where it potentially could come from, and really importantly, where it's flowing from, and that gets down to building design and site design. So, great question.
Yeah, flood insurance costs are a big piece of due diligence. Had a building under contract along a river in Maine, and the current owner was paying like $7,000 a year for flood insurance, and my buyer was quoted like $30,000 for what they were going to have to pay, which just killed the deal. I don't think the building ever sold.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.